Okay, well, the first question I'll have is what is Corbevax and how is it different from an mRNA vaccine?
So, Peter, and maybe just as an FYI, can you make sure you direct who that question goes to? Because sometimes we're like, okay, who's going to jump first?
Sure, absolutely, of course. Well, I tell you what, Dr. Lena, if you don't mind answering that
So
first one for us.
maybe I can start. So Corbevax is a protein-based vaccine that we, of course, developed at our Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development in conjunction with Biological E. So Corbevax is actually the trademark name that Biological E gave to their vaccine produced in India. Being a protein-based vaccine, it means that we in the laboratory use a very, very interesting system, which is the yeast system, as our producer. Is pretty much like brewing beer, but instead of brewing beer, we're brewing proteins. And these proteins, which mimic a protein of the virus, in this case, a little subunit of the spike, is the one that eventually is going to trigger the immune response and activate and neutralize the COVID-19 virus. And compared to the RNA or adenoviruses, is that we actually immunize with the protein directly rather than codes of either DNA or RNA that needs to still be processed within our bodies to produce the protein, because ultimately the proteins are the ones who are the ones that activate the immune response.
And I would say, the advantage of this is it's the process that we use is through yeast fermentation. It's a vegan process, so no human cells or animal cells, and people find that attractive. But also It's a process that's well vetted and tested. So it's the same process used to make recombinant hepatitis B vaccine that all of us got as kids. And so parents and people are familiar with the technology. And more importantly, it's a process that, because it's been around for a while, it's in place for producing vaccines locally in Brazil and Argentina and India and Bangladesh and Vietnam and the list goes on. And so if you want to make a vaccine for global health that could be made at the scale needed, billions of doses, it could be made locally. This is the one that checks all the boxes, and it's got a safety profile that people have known about for decades. So people, feel comfortable with it. Simple refrigeration, as I say, no limit to what you can make. It's the least expensive. The Indian government has just priced this at 145 rupees, and you're probably saying, okay, what's 145 rupees? It's $1.90. $1.90 a dose, so it's going to be the least expensive of all the COVID vaccines. So this is pretty exciting because everyone's talking about vaccine equity, and the multinationals are producing these high technology vaccines that are very expensive, in the hope that a few crumbs filter down to the low and middle income countries and say, we don't have to live that way. We can empower the vaccine producers locally to make this. So we, as Mary Elena says, we've transferred no patents, no strings attached. And we let them own the vaccine that they scale up and produce. So we help in the production, but ultimately it's what's called decolonization, letting the vaccine producers themselves own it. So Indian company, Biologically, owns Corbevax. The Indonesian company, Bio Farma, will own their vaccine. They're actually, because it's vegan, they're going to make a halal version for Muslim majority countries. And the list goes on. So this is why we're so excited.
And this concept of decolonizing or making them indigenous, it's like their homegrown vaccine, which is very different. I mean, even though these are very well-known vaccine producers, and they clearly have many of them, including Biological E, vaccine portfolios that have been providing, in fact, vaccines mostly to a lot of our Latin American and other countries already. But usually they're not technologies that they themselves develop from the scratch. They're always either vaccines that have been developed by big multinationals that then go off patent, and therefore then they can be reproduced or called upon as their own, but they're really coming from somebody else having designed the process. These vaccines that we developed with Peter in the vaccine center would enable them to call them really homegrown indigenous, because they really get the starter kit, but then they have to go through the entire process to develop, and rather than receiving something that it's really already, created by somebody else. So I think it's very unique, and they've been very eager. In fact, Biological E is very proud that they have this indigenous vaccine. As you know, they're collaborating with many others, including Johnson and Johnson. But for them, it's a very different feeling to also say that Corbevax is Biological E's vaccine that was co-developed with us, but ultimately is their own homegrown.